When the Ottomans conquered a city, the war didn't end when the swords fell silent. For thousands of women, that moment marked the beginning of something far worse. The empire didn't just take land or treasure, it took identity. Wives of fallen warriors were dragged from their homes, stripped of their names, and thrown into a system so calculated, so cold, it turned survival itself into punishment. Some were inspected like livestock, sold in bustling slave markets. Others were forced into golden prisons, the harems, where obedience was the only path to staying alive. And for a few, the punishment was far darker, humiliation so public it broke not only them, but entire nations watching. This isn't just another tale of empire. It's a reminder of how cruelty can wear the mask of civilization. If stories like this move you, hit like and subscribe. It helps uncover the parts of history that were meant to stay buried. Share this video so others can learn what power really looked like behind the Ottoman throne. When the Ottomans marched into victory, they carried more than banners and blades. They carried laws. Every conquest was followed by a process, precise and practiced, as if cruelty itself had been drafted into policy. What most people imagine as chaos after war was, in their world, order, recorded, organized, signed, and sealed by imperial decree. The Ottomans didn't just enslave, they engineered enslavement. You have to understand, this was no random looting or wild aftermath. When a city fell, the soldiers knew their rights, because those rights were written into law. The spoils of war were classified, documented, and divided. Among them, the most sought-after prize wasn't gold or land. It was people. The wives of defeated warriors became the living trophies of empire, proof that even the proud could be broken. From the moment the gates opened, Ottoman officials entered with ink, not just iron. They separated men from women, children from mothers. What followed wasn't rage, but routine. Scribes took notes. Officers counted captives. Inspectors assigned categories. Each act of subjugation was deliberate, like parts of a well-oiled machine. Every empire has its symbols of power. The Ottomans was bureaucracy. Their conquest lived not only on battlefields, but in ledgers. To them, this system was justified by faith. The doctrine of sabaya, spoils of war, gave legal cover to what unfolded. Under their interpretation of Islamic jurisprudence, women captured in conquest became property of the victors. The empire didn't invent this rule, but it perfected it. It refined cruelty until it felt like order. And once an empire gives atrocity a name, it stops feeling like atrocity. Imagine the scene. The air thick with smoke and fear. Soldiers shouting orders as scribes marked names that would soon vanish. Women clutching children, waiting to hear where they'd be sent. There was no language for mercy, only terms of ownership. The Ottomans didn't need chaos. They had law, and that made the suffering worse. Because when violence wears the robe of legality, it becomes permanent. It builds structures that outlive the victims. And that's what the Ottomans achieved. A system that could repeat itself with precision, from one province to the next. You could trace the same process from Hungary to Greece, from the Balkans to Arabia. Capture, separate, record, assign, sell. But why target the wives of fallen men? Because power is psychological. Killing a warrior ends his fight. Breaking his wife ends his legacy. In the Ottoman worldview, submission was not enough. Humiliation had to be inherited. A noblewoman dragged through the streets sent a message stronger than any cannon. It told her people, your strength means nothing. Your bloodline is ours. Your future is already written. Inside this empire of chains, humanity was reduced to paperwork. Women became statistics. Their beauty, age, and health were all recorded in columns and numbers. A scribe's quill decided their worth. A buyer's hand decided their fate. The empire functioned like a market, clean, documented, impersonal. And that was its greatest horror. This was conquest turned into administration. Bureaucrats replaced butchers. Everything was neat, deliberate, and justified. The Ottomans saw themselves not as destroyers, but as organizers of divine order. They didn't need to shout. Their silence was worse, because silence meant certainty. Certainty meant approval. Even religion was bent to serve empire. Scholars issued fatwas validating enslavement. Judges drafted rulings to make it lawful. The law wrapped cruelty in ritual. Victims became entries in a divine ledger. And once belief intertwines with bureaucracy, escape becomes impossible. For the wives of the defeated, life became a waiting game. Some were sent to labor fields. Others were prepared for transport to markets. The most striking among them were kept for Istanbul, destined for courts and harems. Each path was shaped by rank, beauty, and luck, but none led to freedom. Every route ended in ownership. It's easy to think of empire as a distant idea, something made of maps and generals. But in the Ottoman system, empire was built on bodies, each catalogued, priced, and relocated. What made it monstrous was not its size, but its order. It worked too well. Every record kept meant another life erased under the guise of documentation. And these records endured. Historians later found the ledgers, neat handwriting listing names that no longer existed, women whose stories were compressed into numbers. They had no identity beyond the ink that defined their value. When we think of cruelty, we often imagine chaos, screaming, fire, destruction. But the Ottomans showed another kind, the kind that feels calm, professional, signed and stamped. That calmness is what made it unbearable, because every act of brutality was not only allowed, it was expected. The empire called it order. History calls it dehumanization. And at its heart was a simple truth. By turning conquest into paperwork, the Ottomans ensured their cruelty could be repeated, endlessly, efficiently, and without question. For the women trapped within it, survival meant invisibility. They learned silence. They learned obedience. Some prayed for death, others for a chance to vanish. In this system, even endurance became a crime, because it served as another entry in the ledger. The moment a woman's name was written, she no longer belonged to herself. This was the beginning of a machinery that would span generations, a structure so efficient that even centuries later, its echo still lingers, in stories half remembered, in archives that never stopped recording. And this was only the beginning, because once these women were taken, their fate had only just begun to unfold. The conquest was only the start. What followed was colder. After the soldiers left and the dust settled, the empire's officials stepped in. Their task wasn't to fight, but to sort. What you see here isn't a moment of chaos. It's a system. It begins quietly, almost bureaucratically, with lists, ropes, and commands. The captives were gathered into large courtyards, sometimes mosques, sometimes open squares. They were made to stand in rows under the eyes of Ottoman officers. Men were bound together and marched one way. Women and children were taken another. Families tried to cling to each other, but the soldiers broke those bonds without hesitation. To the empire, unity among captives was dangerous. It made people harder to sell. For the wives of fallen warriors, the next phase was humiliation disguised as inspection. Ottoman physicians and scribes moved through the lines. They examined every face, every body, recording features with mechanical precision. Teeth were checked. Hands were turned over. Scars noted. Age estimated. These were not doctors of mercy. They were appraisers. A young woman with clear skin and symmetrical features might be marked for Constantinople. Her name went into a separate ledger, her fate sealed before she took another step. Older women, widows, or those bearing signs of hardship were assigned to labor markets, weaving, cleaning, or farming until exhaustion claimed them. The process was efficient and final. In this world, the value of a human life could be summed up in a few pen strokes. The Ottomans didn't waste. Every skill, every trait was tallied. A woman who could sing or embroider fetched more. One fluent in another language might serve in a noble house. The state taxed every sale, earning profit from each act of dehumanization. What's striking is how ordinary it became. Market inspectors, traders, and clerks carried out their roles without visible guilt. They saw themselves as part of order, not cruelty. To them, this was routine, an economy built on flesh. And those markets weren't hidden. In cities like Bursa, Edirne, and Istanbul, they stood in open view, often beside spice stalls and textile shops. Merchants bartered loudly while women stood on display, eyes cast down. Buyers approached, asked questions, sometimes reached out to test the merchandise. Strength, beauty, obedience, all examined in public. Imagine standing there. Strangers debating your price, deciding your worth. The sound of coins clinking louder than your own voice. And even if you begged, even if you screamed, the crowd barely looked up, because by that point, you were not seen as a person. You were a commodity. This wasn't random cruelty. It was institutional. Each sale was documented by scribes who maintained records for tax collectors and judges. The ledgers still exist, pages of ink listing human lives reduced to numbers and physical descriptions. Some entries read simply, female, age 22, fair complexion, good teeth. That was all history allowed her to be. The Ottomans prided themselves on structure. They called this canon law. Under it, slavery was orderly, regulated, almost sanitized. Rules governed behavior, prices, inheritance. A buyer could not mutilate or kill his purchase without consequence, not because of compassion, but because that life had financial value. The empire understood economics better than empathy. For many women, reaching the market alive was considered luck. The journey from captured villages often stretched for weeks. They walked in chains, exposed to hunger, illness, and assault. Some collapsed along the way and were left behind. Others arrived too weak to stand. Those who survived found themselves thrust under a canopy of buyers' gazes, forced to perform compliance. Traders encouraged smiles. A woman who appeared defiant could be beaten on the spot, her price reduced. The humiliation wasn't incidental. It was built into the process. Submission had to be displayed publicly. A bowed head reassured the buyer that resistance was gone. Those chosen for Constantinople faced a new kind of selection. They were clean, dressed, and brought before higher officials. The best among them, meaning the most beautiful, the most composed, were sent to the Topkapi Palace, destined for the imperial harem. What awaited there wasn't freedom or fortune. It was another form of imprisonment, gilded but absolute. The rest were sold to households, labor camps, or provincial governors. Some were traded across seas to Cairo or Damascus. Others disappeared into distant estates, never heard from again. For the empire, it didn't matter where they went, as long as the ledgers balanced. But this market wasn't just about control. It was a message. By turning the wives of warriors into property, the Ottomans erased symbols of resistance. Every auction was a declaration that defiance had a cost, one paid not only by soldiers, but by their families. And so the trade continued. Month after month, year after year. Prices rose during major campaigns, when captives flooded in. Traders grew wealthy. Officials grew complacent. And society adjusted to a world where human lives were simply another asset to be taxed. You can almost picture it. The crowd moving from stall to stall, arguing over fabric, spices, and then people. Somewhere in that noise, a woman whispers a prayer in a language no one understands. Somewhere, a child clings to a hand that's about to be pulled away. And in the empire's eyes, all of it is progress, civilization, order. Because when cruelty is wrapped in law, it no longer feels cruel. It feels normal. But for the women marked and sold, the nightmare was far from over. Their next destination would decide everything: comfort, survival, or slow erasure. For those sent to Constantinople, the nightmare took on a different shape. The journey ended not in a dungeon or a field, but in marble corridors lined with gold. At first glance, the imperial harem appeared majestic: polished floors, scented air, silk curtains. But for the women who entered, it was a cage so elegant it disguised the bars. These women came from every corner of the empire: Greek, Serbian, Circassian, Hungarian. Some were daughters of nobles. Others were wives of soldiers. All had been renamed. The moment they crossed the threshold, their past vanished. A new name was given, often Turkish, and with it came a new identity. It wasn't granted. It was imposed. Inside, silence ruled. Conversations were hushed, movements measured. Every word could be reported to the wrong ear. Eunuchs patrolled the halls, men stripped of power, now guarding those who had none. Their presence ensured obedience. Their eyes missed nothing. To survive here, a woman needed more than beauty. She needed instinct. The harem was a hierarchy, a living court where rank meant everything. At the top stood the Valide Sultan, mother of the reigning sultan. Beneath her, favored concubines and attendants, each competing for position. Below them, the newly arrived, nameless and afraid. Those who learned fast could climb. A soft voice at the right moment, a gesture of respect, a show of loyalty. Every move mattered. A single mistake could end a life. Those who failed to please were not executed outright. They were forgotten, assigned to the lowest tasks, confined to distant quarters, stripped of fine clothing until they faded into anonymity. Outsiders imagined the harem as a place of pleasure and privilege. The truth was quieter. Days began before dawn with rituals and chores. Some women were taught languages, music, or embroidery to entertain the court. Others were prepared for presentation, trained to walk, to speak, to bow. The walls glittered, but behind every shimmer lay fear. What made the harem terrifying wasn't only control. It was transformation. Over time, women forgot the sound of their native tongue. They prayed in a faith they didn't choose. They answered to names they didn't recognize. Every reminder of their old life faded, replaced by the customs of the empire. This wasn't just captivity. It was erasure disguised as refinement. Occasionally, one of them caught the sultan's attention. To the outside world, that seemed like fortune. In reality, it was another prison. A favorite gained luxury, but lost freedom entirely. She could not leave, could not refuse, could not remember who she once was. Her value depended on the whims of one man. When his interest died, so did hers. Even among them, fear lingered. Rumors traveled faster than footsteps. A woman who offended a higher rank might vanish overnight. Some were said to be sent to remote palaces, others to the sea. The truth was often whispered but rarely confirmed. The empire preferred mystery. It kept everyone obedient. Still, there were those who adapted. Some learned to play the politics of the palace, aligning with powerful eunuchs, pleasing the Valide Sultan, surviving by cunning. They became influential behind closed doors, advising, scheming, protecting the few they trusted. But even power within the cage was still confinement. It only made the bars more polished. Imagine walking through those corridors, hearing laughter from one room, sobbing from another. One woman whispers prayers in Greek. Another hums a song from a village she barely recalls. Every sound a fragment of a life lost. And outside, the city moves on, unaware that within the palace, thousands of souls live in quiet captivity. The irony was painful. The empire boasted of its enlightenment, its architecture, its justice. Yet within its heart stood a system that turned women into ornaments, displayed, silenced, and controlled. The harem was the mirror of the empire itself, beautiful, ordered, and built on suffering. Sometimes a woman would give birth. The child's fate depended on the father's attention. A son might grow to wield power, unaware of his mother's pain. A daughter might inherit her silence. Even motherhood offered no refuge. The empire claimed every life it created. In rare cases, a concubine's son became sultan. That woman rose to immense authority, the Valide Sultan, mother of the ruler. But even she carried the memory of chains. Her throne was carved from the same system that once enslaved her. Power didn't erase the past. It only dressed it in silk. The harem's cruelty wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It worked through routine, repetition, obedience, time. Years turned captives into courtiers. The empire's strength lay not only in its armies, but in its ability to reshape minds. And outside those walls, no one questioned it. Visitors saw elegance and discipline. They admired the gardens, the fountains, the order. Few asked what kept it all so quiet. Few dared, because to question the system was to question the empire itself. The women who lived there rarely escaped. The few who did carried memories they could not describe. They spoke of silence heavier than chains, of faces forgotten, of a name they no longer remembered was once their own. The gilded cage was not made to kill. It was made to erase. Slowly, gracefully, completely. And yet, for the empire, it wasn't enough. Taking their bodies wasn't the end. The Ottomans wanted their souls. Inside the Ottoman system, conquest did not end with chains. It continued through faith. The empire understood that the deepest form of control was not physical but spiritual. A body could resist. A mind could still hope. But if belief itself could be reshaped, resistance would vanish. And so, religion became a weapon. When a Christian city fell, its churches were often stripped, converted, or burned. Crosses removed, bells silenced, altars replaced. The same transformation awaited the captives. Women taken from their homes were forced to abandon their faith, not through persuasion, but through pressure, starvation, isolation, humiliation. Refusal was not an act of courage. It was a sentence. Women who resisted conversion faced beatings, confinement in darkness, or slow starvation until they whispered the words of submission. Those who gave in found no relief. Their new faith was not born of conviction. It was forced through fear. The process followed a grim routine. In large cities, ceremonies were staged to mark mass conversions. Captives stood in rows before officials and imams. They were told to repeat the Islamic declaration of faith. Many did so in trembling voices, hoping it might spare them. Some refused until the end, beaten until their strength broke. The Ottomans called these events acts of mercy. To the victims, they were rituals of erasure. Once converted, a woman's past was legally severed. Under Ottoman law, a Muslim could not return to a non-Muslim identity. That meant no escape. Even if she fled, even if she reached her homeland, she could never truly go back. Her family, bound by faith, would see her as lost. Her church would refuse her. The empire had found a way to imprison her forever, not behind walls, but through belief. To the Ottomans, this system was righteous. They viewed conversion as salvation. The state presented it as spiritual victory, proof that the empire spread both power and divine truth. Yet beneath the language of piety lay pure domination. This wasn't about saving souls. It was about ownership. The empire didn't ask what a woman believed. It dictated what she must become. Imagine the confusion. One morning, she prays to her God. By nightfall, she's forced to recite in a tongue she barely understands. Her name is changed to fit her new identity. Maria becomes Aisha. Elena becomes Fatima. The old self is gone. Even memory becomes dangerous. If she's caught whispering her old prayers, punishment follows. Faith has been weaponized into surveillance. This transformation wasn't only personal. It was generational. Any child born to a converted mother was automatically Muslim, binding future bloodlines to the empire. The Ottomans didn't need to conquer a city twice. Once faith was rewritten, the next generation belonged to them. That's how conquest turned permanent. The battlefield might last a day. The faith it imposed lasted forever. Some might ask, did no one resist? They did. Quietly. Secretly. Some women pretended to convert, repeating the words, but keeping their true prayers hidden. At night, they traced crosses on their palms. They whispered hymns under their breath. In the dark, faith survived in fragments. But even that came at risk. Betrayal was always near. One whispered accusation could end a life. The empire rewarded compliance. Converts who displayed devotion were given lighter labor, sometimes gifts or better food. Those who resisted were broken publicly. The Ottomans wanted others to watch, to learn. Pain was the most effective preacher. Historians later found records describing these conversions, legal documents listing new names, official statements declaring faith changes. The handwriting is precise, the tone clinical. To the state, it was paperwork. To the victims, it was burial. And yet, the Ottomans understood something deeper. They knew that destroying faith outright would create martyrs. So they used subtlety. They replaced symbols. They blurred lines. Over years, captives forgot what their old rituals meant. They practiced new ones until habit replaced belief. In this system, religion was not about salvation. It was about compliance. It taught obedience, not devotion. The empire didn't care if heart stayed silent, as long as mouth spoke the right words. But faith is stubborn. Some women, even after decades, carried traces of the past. They taught their children fragments of old songs, gestures of forgotten worship, a hand to the chest, a whispered amen. Small acts that defied erasure. The empire could change their names, but not entirely their souls. Still, the cost of resistance was brutal. Those caught practicing their old religion faced isolation in dark chambers, chained, denied water, left to starve slowly. Others were forced to watch as their friends were beaten for the same defiance. The empire didn't need to kill every rebel. It only needed to make one example. What makes this part of history so haunting is how effective it was. Generations passed. Families forgot their origins. The children of captives grew up calling themselves Ottoman. Their ancestors' prayers vanished. Entire communities were reshaped not by sword, but by ritual. And yet, buried in those transformations were stories of quiet defiance. Women who taught their daughters forbidden names, who refused to let old words die completely. In them, fragments of truth survived, invisible but unbroken. The Ottomans believed that through forced faith, they could erase the past. What they didn't see was that even in silence, memory endures. You can bury a voice, but not its echo. The empire turned religion into policy, salvation into control. What began as conquest became conversion, and what began as faith became a cage. But for the wives of noblemen, for those once powerful or proud, faith alone wasn't enough to destroy them. The empire had other plans. Their punishment would be personal, public, and designed to crush not just one life, but the spirit of an entire people. When the Ottomans crushed a rebellion or conquered a noble house, they didn't simply end bloodlines. They staged lessons. The wives of fallen commanders were not hidden or sold quietly. They were turned into messages. The empire understood the psychology of defeat, that terror travels faster than armies. And nothing spread fear like the public breaking of the proud. For noble women, captivity began not with silence, but spectacle. They were dragged through streets lined with soldiers and citizens, bound, beaten, displayed. The procession wasn't random cruelty. It was performance. Every step reminded onlookers that resistance carried a cost beyond death. The empire made these scenes deliberate. In each conquered city, the wives of local leaders were paraded before the survivors. Their jewelry stripped, their clothes torn, their faces smeared with dust. They represented everything once powerful, now reduced to pleading figures beneath the boot of empire. It wasn't about punishment. It was about proof. Proof that no one stood above the law of conquest. Then came branding. Hot irons pressed against skin, marking ownership, erasing dignity. The symbols varied, sometimes initials of generals, sometimes religious inscriptions. To the Ottomans, it was control. To the victims, it was living disfigurement. Every glance from another captive reminded them of what they had lost: status, safety, identity. Those considered dangerous, women tied to powerful families or former rulers, faced slower destruction. They were forced into roles meant to mock their former lives. A princess might be assigned to clean the floors of a military barracks. The wife of a general might serve wine to the officers who killed her husband. Each act rehearsed humiliation until it became routine. And yet, humiliation wasn't the end. The empire wanted endurance, pain that lingered. Some women were locked in iron cages and hung from gates, visible to their people day after day. They were given water, but little food. So death arrived slowly. The message was clear: defiance starves, obedience survives. Mothers suffered worst. The Ottomans feared lineage. A child of a fallen leader could one day claim revenge. So the empire cut futures at the root. Infants were taken, sold, or executed before their mother's eyes. The cruelty was precise. A guard held the child up before the crowd. The mother screamed, and the soldiers watched. Because fear isn't just what happens to one person. It's what others witness. Sometimes the officers gave a choice: one child to spare, one to lose. It wasn't mercy. It was psychological ruin. No parent can carry such a decision and remain whole. The Ottomans knew that. Breaking the mind was more effective than breaking the body. Even in death, the spectacle continued. Some women were killed slowly, forced to watch others fall before their turn. The empire didn't rush. Pain was recorded, staged, and spread. Witnesses carried the story across provinces, each retelling amplifying the lesson. Surrender quickly. Never defy. The brutality had structure. Scribes recorded punishments as if taking inventory. Wife of rebel commander, executed by hanging. Body displayed. These weren't the acts of wild soldiers. They were policies. Signed, stamped, filed. And yet, within this theater of power, moments of silent defiance endured. A noble woman refusing to bow. A mother spitting at her captors. Small gestures, easily crushed, but unforgettable to those who saw them. They reminded everyone watching that even in chains, defiance could exist. Some women were used as tools of conquest. The empire sent them back to their cities as symbols of submission. Once they had been figures of authority. Now they were emissaries of fear, forced to urge their people to comply. Survival required betrayal. And so they walked through their own streets as strangers, eyes lowered, surrounded by guards. To the empire, it was genius. To the victims, it was the final degradation, being made to silence their own. In rare cases, captives were forced into fights for entertainment. Women pitted against one another before crowds of soldiers, starving, desperate. The empire called it amusement. It was conditioning, turning suffering into spectacle, empathy into applause. The Ottomans didn't want only obedience. They wanted transformation. They wanted witnesses to see once proud figures crumble and believe that resistance was hopeless. Each act of cruelty was multiplied through rumor, through memory. Cities surrendered not just to soldiers, but to the stories carried ahead of them. And yet, cruelty never erases completely. Some who survived carried fragments of truth. They told whispers to their children, warnings of what empire truly meant. Their voices were faint, but they endured. When historians later read the Ottoman records, they found no remorse. The tone was cold, administrative. Each execution, each branding, each confiscation written as standard procedure. In those lines, the humanity of victims vanished entirely. What makes this chapter of history so haunting isn't only the scale, but the method. Every act was deliberate, measured, approved. The empire turned human suffering into bureaucracy, and that precision made it unstoppable. The wives of fallen warriors became symbols of defeat, of warning, of ownership. Their pain served purpose. Their silence became policy. And through them, the Ottomans ruled not just land, but memory. But what happens when cruelty becomes law? When every act of domination is written, stamped, and sanctified? That question leads to the darkest truth of all. How the empire transformed violence into order and made destruction feel like civilization. When the Ottomans called their empire a realm of order, they weren't lying. It was order, built from silence. Every woman they broke, every name they erased, every ledger they filled, all served a single purpose: to make the victims disappear so completely that even their memory obeyed. But silence never fades. It lingers, buried beneath centuries, whispering through the cracks of history. For the wives of defeated warriors, survival rarely meant freedom. Those who lived long enough to see the wars and found themselves in a world that no longer recognized them. Their faces aged in captivity. Their tongues forgot familiar words. Even if released or ransomed, they returned to homes that saw them as strangers. Their husbands were dead. Their children scattered. Their faith rewritten. Some were turned away by their own families, seen as tainted or impure. Home became exile. Across the Balkans and Eastern Europe, the consequences were visible for generations. Entire villages lost their women. Birth rates collapsed. Families vanished from records. In some regions, even centuries later, you can trace sudden gaps in genealogy. Names missing, bloodlines cut. The empire's bureaucracy may have ended, but its damage lived on in demographics, in silence, in the unspoken grief of nations. And the trauma was generational. Children born from enslavement carried confusion in their blood. They belonged everywhere and nowhere. Raised as Ottomans but born of conquest, they inherited a fragmented identity. Their mothers' stories were forbidden. Their fathers were often unknown. The empire erased origins so cleanly that even those who wished to remember could not. Historians once celebrated Ottoman order. They wrote of architecture, administration, diplomacy. The ledgers impressed them. Neat columns, precise handwriting, evidence of a structured state. But those same pages held something darker. Between the inked lines lay the lives turned into property, the prayers replaced, the cries never recorded. Civilization, it seems, kept excellent paperwork. When researchers finally opened those archives centuries later, they found the truth the empire had hidden in plain sight. Lists of captives sold, prices paid, markets taxed, names crossed out, replaced by new ones. Some records were so detailed they included physical descriptions, skills, fertility notes. Every page a quiet confession of systematic dehumanization. But what the documents couldn't capture was the sound, the pleading voices, the songs sung under breath, the prayers whispered in languages forbidden. Those lived only in memory, and memory is fragile. By the time scholars began to look, most of those voices were gone. The women who could have told their stories had long turned to dust. What remained were fragments, folk tales, lullabies, warnings told by grandmothers who didn't know their origin. In them, traces of truth survived, disguised as myth. The empire succeeded in what it wanted most, permanence. Not just territorial, but psychological. It proved that an atrocity wrapped in law could outlast witnesses. That's the legacy of silence, not forgetting by accident, but forgetting by design. And yet, history always finds cracks. In small villages, local chronicles mention unnamed captives who returned. In letters, travelers recorded glimpses of sorrow they didn't understand. A woman praying alone in a foreign tongue, a slave who wept at the sight of her homeland's mountains. Each clue, faint as it was, pointed to a wound that never healed. Modern historians, reading between those faint lines, began to piece together what the empire tried to erase. They traced trade routes of human lives, connecting markets from Belgrade to Cairo. They compared names, ages, prices. Slowly, the invisible became visible again. But for every record uncovered, thousands remain lost. Some were destroyed, others buried in archives untouched. The Ottoman state was meticulous. It didn't just commit atrocities. It documented them with pride. That's why silence became structural. When cruelty is written in ink, it stops looking like cruelty. It looks like governance. And for centuries, the world accepted that version. Even today, many history books skip over the women, focusing instead on sultans, generals, and trade. The victims remain footnotes, numbers and margins. Their suffering categorized as collateral, their endurance unnamed. But silence, once broken, echoes loudly. The stories that surface now remind us what conquest truly meant. Not glory, not architecture, but lives dismantled in the name of order. These women were not just victims of their time. They were witnesses to how civilization can be built on cruelty, disguised as progress. Their legacy is not found in statues or records, but in the questions they force us to ask. How many stories vanish when power controls the pen? How many truths remain buried under the weight of what nations choose to remember? In the end, the Ottomans proved that empire can destroy more than cities. It can destroy memory itself. But they also proved something they never intended, that even silence leaves evidence. The absence of names, the missing mothers, the erased prayers, all speak louder than the empire's decrees. Every historian who opens an archive, every researcher who reads between the lines, becomes part of their resurrection. Each rediscovered name is defiance. Each documented truth is justice delayed, but not denied. And though their stories may never be complete, each fragment reminds us of a simple truth. Power may silence, but it cannot erase. Time listens. History waits. And eventually, the voices return. The wives of defeated warriors were meant to vanish. Instead, they became eternal witnesses, not through their words, but through the emptiness they left behind. Their silence is history's loudest cry. What you've just heard isn't only a story about the Ottoman Empire. It's a story about how power rewrites truth, about how cruelty can hide behind order, about how entire generations can vanish from memory, not because they were unimportant, but because someone decided they shouldn't be remembered. The wives of fallen warriors were never meant to have voices. Yet here, centuries later, their silence still speaks. It reminds us that civilization can be polished on the surface and brutal underneath. It warns us what happens when law serves cruelty instead of justice. If this story unsettled you, it should. Because history's darkest chapters don't just tell us what was done. They reveal what was allowed. The ledgers may be closed, the empire's gone, but the lessons remain. If you believe these voices deserve to be heard, like this video, subscribe, and share it. Every view keeps their memory alive. Every share pushes back against the silence that once erased them. Thank you for watching. Remember, truth buried in ink still breathes. It only needs someone willing to read between the lines.